In a small, nondescript town, there lived a guy named Daniel. He was just an ordinary college student, balancing studies and part-time work, occasionally staying up too late to tinker with computers. Daniel wasn't particularly daring, but he was curious, especially when it came to the hidden, uncharted parts of the internet. One late night, his curiosity led him to something he never should have found. Scrolling through a forum that hinted at secrets only the dark web could offer, Daniel came across a thread titled Hidden Windows. Hundreds of cryptic comments warned people to stay away, but there were also testimonials. I saw things I can't forget, and it's a path with no return. Something about the warnings felt dramatic, but intriguing. He was hooked. He found the instructions within minutes. Download a Tor browser, access a particular onion link, and follow the rabbit hole. Against his better judgment, he dimmed his room's lights, closed the blinds, and dove in. The link took him to a blank black page with a single line of text that simply read, "The Voyeur's Web, for those who watch and those who are watched." A prompt appeared, requesting a password. Daniel sat back, unsure if he should go further. But before he could reconsider, the screen flickered and text appeared as if someone else were typing directly to him. "Curious, aren't you?" He hesitated, then replied with a simple yes. The website responded with a series of distorted images flashing on the screen. Abandoned warehouses, empty parking lots, and blurry, distant figures who looked like they were being watched from the shadows. Then a new page loaded, displaying a grid of live video feeds, each showing a different scene. The feeds were of real people, in real time, going about their daily lives, entirely unaware they were being watched. A chill crept up his spine. The feeling that this was just some urban legend or prank evaporated. This was real. One feed showed a woman sitting alone in her living room watching TV. Another displayed a man asleep in bed, oblivious to the faint camera light flashing from his alarm clock. In another feed, a mother was helping her child with homework in the kitchen, completely unaware of the invasive lens focused on her. Daniel's stomach twisted. He tried to close the browser, but nothing happened. It was as if his computer had frozen. Then, a new window popped up with a feed he hadn't seen before. It was his own room. Daniel's heart stopped. The feed showed him sitting in his chair, watching the dark web feed, his face illuminated by his computer screen. Every small movement, every nervous glance he took was reflected in the video. Panic surged through him as he realized he was part of this sick network now, both the watcher and the watched. His hands shook as he reached out to shut off the computer, but the cursor wouldn't move, as if an invisible hand had taken control. The feed on his screen began to zoom in, getting closer and closer to his face until he could make out his own terrified expression in sharp detail. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. In his panic, he almost knocked it off his desk, but he forced himself to look. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "You can't hide. We see you." His blood ran cold. He looked around his room, feeling like he was being watched from all angles. Where were they? He scanned the walls, the ceiling. Had he missed some tiny hidden camera? There were no obvious signs, but the phone buzzed again. "Check your closet." Nervously, he looked toward the closet door. It was slightly ajar, and now that he thought about it, he couldn't remember if he'd left it that way. He felt frozen, paralyzed with the knowledge that someone, might be waiting behind that door. His computer screen flickered again, and the live feed from his own room showed the closet door in the background. The delay in the feed was minimal, but it was enough to reveal the door creeping open. Only a crack at first, then more. He watched in horror as a pair of eyes appeared, just barely visible through the narrow opening, watching him from within his own room. Daniel scrambled backward, toppling out of his chair. He barely managed to grab his phone and flashlight before the screen went black. The room fell into an unnatural silence, the only sound his ragged breathing. He shined his flashlight toward the closet, but it was empty. Just as he sighed in relief, a notification popped up on his phone. Another message. "Behind you." He spun around just in time to catch a figure standing in his doorway. The figure was featureless, cloaked in shadows, their face obscured. The stranger stepped forward, moving so close that Daniel could smell something foul, like rotten meat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he felt rooted to the spot. The figure held up a device, a phone. On its screen was a video feed. It was a view of Daniel's house filmed from across the street. The message on the screen read, "You're next." And before he could react, the screen flashed off. The figure vanished, and his room went dark. Daniel bolted out of his house and didn't stop running until he was at the edge of town. He didn't sleep for days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure, heard the echo of that message, felt those eyes still watching him from somewhere, somehow. It's been years since Daniel accessed that hidden corner of the internet. He's moved 3 times, changed his name, even abandoned technology as much as possible. But no matter where he goes, he occasionally feels a familiar chill, as if someone is there, just out of sight, watching. He lives with his curtains closed, his doors locked, but deep down, he knows he can't hide. Not from them. Late one night, Evelyn sat in her tiny, dimly lit apartment, sipping cold coffee as she scrolled through a sea of unfamiliar websites. She'd been doing freelance research for a true crime podcast, her interest piqued by a disturbing series of stories that referenced the marionette game, a bizarre rumor circulating on obscure forums where the game allegedly allowed people to summon the puppeteer. According to the scattered reports, once invited in, the puppeteer would begin to play with you. Evelyn brushed it off as some exaggerated internet lore. Still, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling of those comments, each filled with vague warnings that felt oddly personal. But curiosity got the better of her. She found an encrypted forum that detailed how to begin the game. The first rule was simple. Go to a dark place where no one could hear you and say, "Puppeteer, let's play." Evelyn wasn't the type to scare easily. With her job, she dealt with horrifying content every day. She dimmed her laptop's screen, shut off her apartment lights, and let her room sink to total darkness. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "Puppeteer, let's play." Nothing happened. She felt a bit foolish, but was relieved too. She laughed to herself and reached for her phone to get back to work. But just as she turned on the lights, her phone vibrated, a new notification appearing on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "Are you ready?" Evelyn froze. She hadn't told anyone what she was doing tonight. She dismissed it as a prank and put her phone down. But then another message buzzed through. "Look behind you." Her heart skipped. She looked around the room, convincing herself it was just a coincidence. Then she looked down at her phone. The unknown sender had sent an image. Evelyn opened it with a trembling hand, her stomach twisting into knots. The picture showed her sitting right there in her darkened room, only it wasn't just her. Standing behind her was a figure with vacant, hollow eyes and a twisted, unnatural grin looming inches from her back. She whipped around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to leave, but her rational mind insisted it was just some elaborate hack or prank. She shut her phone off and forced herself to breathe. After a few minutes, her pulse slowed, and she convinced herself it was just someone messing with her, an elaborate hoax, nothing more. But then her computer screen blinked to life, the darkness broken by the sickly green glow of a chat window that hadn't been there before. 3 words appeared on the screen. "Let's play, Evelyn." Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Her fingers were numb, her skin cold, but she managed to type back, "Who are you?" The reply came immediately. "The puppeteer. You asked for me." She scrambled to shut the laptop, but the screen stayed on and the text kept appearing, line after line, flooding the screen with messages. Rule 2, you cannot stop until I say so. Rule 3, I move, you move. Evelyn watched as her cursor began to move on its own, scrolling up and down, selecting files from her computer, digging into her folders. Old photos popped up, pictures from years ago that she hadn't looked at in ages. It was as if the puppeteer was rifling through her life, exposing her memories, her secrets. Every image had been altered, her face distorted, her eyes erased, her mouth widened into an unnatural, gaping smile. Her breathing became shallow. She typed back in desperation, "Stop." "I never stop," he replied. "I'm already here." A faint scratching sound filled the room, coming from inside the walls, as if something with long, brittle nails was trying to dig its way out. The sound grew louder, more desperate, coming from all directions. It was behind her, above her, underneath the floorboards. Her phone buzzed again, but she was too terrified to look. Finally, the scratching stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then a single knock came from her closet door. Evelyn's eyes darted to the closet. The handle twisted slowly, creaking, as if someone or something was trying to open it from the inside. She backed away, her entire body shaking, but the door stopped moving just short of opening. The room was dead silent. The green glow from her laptop was the only light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and bend toward her. On the laptop screen, a new message appeared. Rule 4, never turn your back on me. She wanted to run but felt frozen, glued to the floor. Summoning what little courage she had left, she glanced at the closet door, half expecting the monstrous figure from the photo to come crawling out. The door creaked open an inch, then another, then a sliver more. But nothing emerged. The silence was suffocating. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, she bolted toward the front door, flinging it open and stumbling into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, gasping for air under the streetlights. She looked back, half expecting the figure to be there, standing in her doorway, grinning. It took her hours to calm down, to reassure herself it had been a bad joke, an elaborate hack, or maybe even a nightmare. She didn't dare go back until dawn, and when she did, the apartment was empty, just as she'd left it. But the fear lingered, burrowing into her mind, like the memory of that distorted face. Days turned to weeks, and Evelyn tried to go back to normal, to bury the experience. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, always, by something lurking just beyond her sight. Her phone would occasionally buzz with strange notifications. Her computer would glitch and flicker as if someone else were controlling it, and she could still hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. But it wasn't until she received a final message from the unknown number that she knew she would never escape. The message was just 2 words, haunting her, chilling her to her core. Game over. Miles was an insomniac. Ever since he was a kid, he'd struggled with long, dark nights filled with restless hours staring at his ceiling. To pass the time, he'd scroll through obscure websites, random message boards, looking for anything to keep his mind occupied. But tonight, he stumbled across something different. It started with an anonymous post on a forgotten forum titled The Sleepless Ones. It was a strange name, but it intrigued him. The post was simple, almost cryptic. If you're up at this hour, we might be alike. There's a door only people like us can open, but once you step through, there's no going back. Most people would have ignored it, but Miles felt drawn in, almost compelled. At the bottom of the post was a link, with no description or preview. Against his better judgment, he clicked it. The page was stark black, with an unsettling animated door that looked like it was trembling, waiting. At the bottom was a single line of text, "Knock if you're ready." Miles, feeling a bit foolish, clicked on the door. His screen flickered, and then something strange happened. It was as if a veil had lifted, and he could see through his own webcam, a feed of himself staring at his own computer, illuminated in the dim light of his room. But it wasn't just him in the frame. Standing in the corner right behind him was a tall, faceless figure, its outline barely visible in the shadows. The figure leaned forward, its head tilting unnaturally as it stared down at him. Miles whipped around, but the room was empty. He turned back to the screen, his heart hammering, his pulse in his ears. The figure was gone, and the website had reloaded. Now it showed a series of commands. Each one was specific, eerie, as if the person on the other end knew his every movement. Check the window, look under the bed, don't look at the clock. A message appeared in the chat box below. You've already let me in. Miles couldn't move, couldn't look away. He typed back, his hands trembling, "Who are you?" The reply was immediate. "I am the Shadow. You've seen me in your darkest nights, haven't you?" As he read those words, a memory surfaced. A childhood fear he'd almost forgotten. As a boy, Miles had always felt a presence in his room, just on the edge of his vision, watching him in the darkest hours. He'd convinced himself it was his imagination, just the product of a child's mind. But now, faced with these words, he wasn't so sure. Another message appeared. The Sleepless Ones. We find each other, don't we? He closed the laptop, hoping to shut it all out, but the room felt heavy, like someone else was breathing beside him, watching. His phone buzzed. Another message. You can't close the door. Not now. Terrified, Miles grabbed his phone and called a friend, Sam, who lived nearby. Sam answered, groggy but concerned when he heard the panic in Miles's voice. After a few minutes of pleading, Sam agreed to come over. Miles sat on his bed, his back against the wall, scanning the room. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light distorted. Minutes felt like hours, and just when he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, there was a knock at his door. Relief washed over him. He opened the door, expecting Sam, but there was no one there. He stepped into the hall, looking both ways. The silence was deafening. He closed the door and backed away, his mind racing. Then his phone buzzed again. Another message. Check the door. He stared at the text, his hands cold, his mind reeling. He walked back toward the door and looked through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing, but slowly, like something out of a nightmare, a shadow moved into view. A tall, faceless figure stood in the hallway, staring directly into the peephole as if it knew he was watching. It reached out, placing one hand on his door. Panicking, Miles backed away, clutching his phone. Another message came through. Nowhere to go, Miles. Then, the lights in his apartment flickered. The walls seemed to close in, dark shadows spilling across every surface. A strange, suffocating feeling filled the air, and he heard a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging down the walls. His phone vibrated once more, and he hesitantly glanced down. Look up. He raised his eyes slowly to the ceiling, dreading what he might see. Hovering above him, clinging to the ceiling with impossibly long limbs, was the shadowy figure, its faceless head tilted, staring down at him. Then, with an unsettling fluidity, it began to crawl down the wall toward him, its limbs bending and twisting at grotesque angles. Miles stumbled back, hitting the wall. He screamed, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, like the thing had stolen it. As it drew closer, his phone buzzed with a final message. The sleepless ones always find each other. Welcome to the darkness, Miles. The figure loomed over him, its shadow swallowing the room. And then, everything went black. When Miles's friends came to check on him the next day, his apartment was empty. His phone was lying on the floor, the last message still open on the screen. Welcome to the sleepless ones. As the wind howled outside, Lena sat alone in her small, cluttered apartment, scrolling mindlessly through random websites to distract herself from her usual evening dread. She lived in a high-rise, alone on the 11th floor, where the noise of the city below was muffled to a dull hum. Despite her solitude, she had always been unnervingly aware of every creak, every shadow, and every shifting reflection in her dimly lit room. Tonight, she stumbled upon an obscure website with a plain, white background and a single black box that read, "Do you want to see what's hiding in the dark?" Below the box was a single button. Yes. Lena hesitated, chuckling nervously. Just another horror gimmick, she muttered. But her curiosity got the better of her, and with a click, she pressed yes. Her screen went blank. The seconds ticked by, and she was about to close her laptop when a video feed appeared. It was a live view of what looked like her own building, seen from the street below. She felt a chill run down her spine. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was a random building that looked like hers. Then, the view zoomed in, focusing on her apartment window on the 11th floor. It was her window. She quickly shut her laptop, her heart hammering. The screen, however, didn't turn off. It flickered. Then the video resumed automatically, showing her window again. Now there was text across the screen. Look outside. Every instinct screamed at her not to do it, but her gaze was drawn almost magnetically to the window. She stood up, cautiously approaching, and peered out into the night. The city lights glittered below, but nothing seemed unusual. She took a deep breath, calming herself. Suddenly, the text on the screen changed to, "Check your phone." Her phone buzzed on the table. Her hands shook as she picked it up, seeing a message from an unknown number. The message read, "I'm closer than you think." Panic set in. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but her fingers felt numb, her thoughts scrambled. Another message came through. "Come to the closet. I'm waiting." Lena's heart skipped a beat as she glanced toward her closet door. It was closed, as it always was, but she had a terrible feeling now, an overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone. She backed away, clutching her phone. Another message buzzed. "Don't ignore me, Lena. I've been watching for a long time." Every hair on her body stood on end. She didn't understand how anyone could know her name, let alone where she lived. She hadn't shared her address or her name on any website recently. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Just as she was about to grab her coat and flee, she heard a sound, a faint rustling, like fabric moving, coming from inside the closet. She froze, every nerve on edge. Her gaze locked onto the closet door, willing it to stay closed. Another message came through, this time with a video attachment. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The video showed her apartment hallway, the one just outside her front door. In the grainy, dark footage, a shadowy figure moved down the hall, slowly, pausing at each door, as if listening. It finally stopped in front of hers, standing silently, as if savoring the moment. The figure raised its hand and pressed it flat against her door, almost reverently. Then, after a few seconds, it leaned down, staring directly into the peephole. The video ended abruptly. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She tried to dial the police, but the phone screen froze, glitching before another message appeared. The police won't understand. She backed into the corner of her room, her eyes darting to every shadow, every surface. The closet door creaked slightly, like just a tiny movement, as if something inside was pressing against it, waiting. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, her name being drawn out slowly. Lena. She stared at the closet, her mouth dry, her body paralyzed with fear. Another message buzzed through. Open the closet, Lena. I want you to see me. She shook her head, tears welling up. She thought she heard footsteps outside her window, even though she was on the 11th floor. Her eyes darted to the window, but there was nothing there, just the dark expanse of the night sky. Another message appeared. You can't hide from me, Lena. You've never been able to. The lights in her apartment flickered, then went out, plunging her into darkness. She grabbed her flashlight from a drawer and flicked it on, the narrow beam slicing through the blackness. She shined it toward the closet, dreading what she might see. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness within. But as her flashlight beam moved across the space, something shifted. A pale hand reached out from the shadows, gripping the edge of the door. The hand was thin, with elongated fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and each finger ended in a jagged, blackened nail. The hand moved, pulling the door open wider, revealing a figure crouched inside. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but its eyes glinted, reflecting the flashlight in a sickly, unnatural way. It was smiling, wide and grotesque, with a mouth that seemed to stretch far too large, filled with rows of small, needle-like teeth. Lena, it whispered, its voice low and hoarse, like a breath escaping a long dead throat. She stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, casting the figure's shadow in horrifying, distorted shapes across the walls. In her final, desperate attempt, she grabbed her phone and ran toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle. But before she could open it, her phone buzzed one last time. The message read, "Going somewhere?" A cold hand closed around her wrist, stopping her in her tracks. She didn't have time to scream before the figure pulled her back, dragging her slowly, inch by inch, toward the closet. She fought, kicking and struggling, but its grip was relentless. As she was pulled into the darkness, the last thing she saw was her phone lying on the floor, a new message lighting up the screen. "The dark is where I live, Lena, and now it's where you'll stay." The door to her apartment clicked shut, the lights flickered back on, and the room fell silent. When the police arrived days later, they found her apartment empty. Her belongings were undisturbed, her phone lying on the floor with a final message that no one could explain. "I'm still here." Tom was used to working late. He was a security guard for a corporate office building that towered over the city with floor after floor of darkened windows and silent hallways. Most of the time, his shifts were uneventful. But one night, just after midnight, everything changed. He was on his usual rounds when he noticed a strange light flickering on the security monitor. It was the feed from the 12th floor, a floor he knew was empty since the company had relocated the entire department a month ago. Yet there, on the grainy black and white screen, he saw a light shing erratically, casting shadows across the walls. Assuming it was just a light malfunction, Tom made his way to the 12th floor. As he stepped out of the elevator, he was met with an eerie silence. The hall was pitch dark, except for a flickering light coming from one of the empty offices down the hall. He moved forward slowly, the squeak of his shoes echoing in the vast emptiness. The air felt cold and damp, a sharp contrast to the building's usual temperature. He reached the office with the flickering light, its door ajar. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, the fluorescent light above blinked erratically, casting odd shadows across the abandoned desks and overturned chairs. The furniture looked as if it had been hastily abandoned, with papers scattered across the floor and forgotten personal items left on the desks. Tom felt a pang of unease. He'd never seen the floor like this. It looked as if something had forced everyone to leave in a hurry. He was about to turn back when he noticed something odd on one of the desks. A small black and white photo lay face up, slightly crumpled. Tom reached for it, and as his fingers brushed its surface, he felt an unnatural chill. He held it up to the light, examining it closely. It was a photo of himself. He blinked, stunned, staring at his own face in the photograph. The image was recent. He was wearing the same uniform, with his hair styled just as it was tonight. But the background in the photo wasn't from the office. It showed him standing in a dark hallway, his expression blank, his eyes wide and empty. A faint rustling sound echoed from the far corner of the office. Tom dropped the photo, his heart racing as he swept his flashlight across the room. He saw nothing but empty desks and chairs. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, or maybe the building settling. But then he heard it again, a soft shuffling sound like footsteps. He turned toward the hallway, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The corridor stretched out before him, like empty and dark, save for the faint, eerie glow from the blinking light. Then he noticed something in the shadows at the end of the hallway, a figure just barely visible in the dim light. It was standing completely still, its face obscured by darkness. Tom's hand shook as he lifted the flashlight, shining it toward the figure. The beam illuminated a woman with long, dark hair covering her face, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She wore an old-fashioned dress, torn and dirty, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. Before he could react, she took a step forward. Tom stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The woman's movements were slow, deliberate, her head tilting with each step as if she were sizing him up. Her feet made no sound against the cold floor, and she seemed to glide more than walk. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway. He reached the elevator, slamming his hand on the button repeatedly. The doors finally slid open, and he rushed inside, frantically pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, he glanced back down the hall. The woman was there, standing just a few feet away, her face finally visible. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring into him, her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. She lifted a hand, and Tom saw that her fingers were elongated and sharp, each one tipped with a blackened nail. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the sight, and Tom felt a surge of relief as the elevator began to descend. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing, his mind racing. Who was that? Why had he never seen her on any of the security feeds? The elevator suddenly lurched to a stop between floors, the lights flickering. Tom's heart sank as he realized he was trapped. He pressed the emergency button, but there was no response, just static from the intercom. Then he heard it. The faint sound of humming, soft and haunting, filled the elevator. It grew louder, echoing off the walls, a slow, eerie tune that sent chills down his spine. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. The emergency hatch at the top of the elevator began to rattle, as if something or someone was trying to get in. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, as the hatch creaked open. A pale hand reached through, followed by the woman's twisted, grinning face. She crawled through the opening, her body bending in unnatural ways, her hollow eyes fixed on Tom. He backed into the corner, his hand clutching his flashlight as a last line of defense. But the woman's grin only widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She whispered in a raspy, broken voice, "I've been waiting for you, Tom." The lights flickered once more, and in the split second of darkness, she vanished. The elevator jolted, then resumed its descent. When the doors finally opened in the lobby, Tom stumbled out, looking over his shoulder, half expecting her to be there. He didn't stay to explain to his supervisor. He dropped his flashlight, sprinted out of the building, and never returned. But for weeks afterward, he'd find strange things in his apartment. Old photos of himself from angles he didn't recognize, scratches on the walls, and sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd hear faint, familiar humming outside his window. One evening, after almost managing to convince himself it had all been a hallucination, he found a new photo slipped under his door. It was a picture of him sleeping in his own bed, taken from the corner of his room. On the back, scrawled in jagged writing, was a single line, "I'm closer than you think." Greg had always been a thrill seeker, the kind of guy who'd explore abandoned buildings and hike through forests at night just to get a rush. But even he had his limits. At least, he thought he did, until he came across the Black Room Challenge on an obscure message board. The post was simple, almost a dare. Enter the Black Room. Sit in complete darkness. Keep your eyes closed no matter what you hear. If you last an hour, you'll be rewarded. It sounded too good to be true, like a gimmick. But Greg's curiosity got the better of him. He messaged the anonymous poster, and within minutes he received an address and a time. Midnight. The location was an old, decrepit house on the outskirts of town. As he approached, a feeling of dread settled in, but he brushed it off. This was what he wanted, wasn't it? When he entered the house, he found a single chair in the middle of an empty room, its walls painted a deep, inky black. There were no windows, no light sources. Just the chair positioned directly in the center, surrounded by an eerie silence. Greg settled into the chair, closed his eyes, and waited. The air was thick, heavy, and strangely cold. For the first few minutes, nothing happened, and he found himself relaxing, almost bored. But then, the room grew colder. He could feel the air shift as if someone or something had entered. He told himself to stay calm, to keep his eyes closed. He knew it was part of the challenge, just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, almost too faint to catch. The words were unintelligible, like someone speaking just behind his ear, their breath brushing against his skin. He shivered, gripping the arms of the chair, fighting the urge to open his eyes. The whispering grew louder, and more voices joined in, a murmuring chorus that filled the room. They spoke in fragments, phrases that made no sense, in voices that ranged from soft, childlike tones to low, guttural growls. The voices overlapped, getting closer and louder until he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "Just a trick," he muttered to himself. "They're just trying to scare me." The voices stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. He exhaled, relieved, but then he felt a presence directly in front of him. Even with his eyes closed, he could sense something leaning in inches from his face. Its breath was rancid, a decaying, sulfuric stench that made him gag. A rough hand brushed against his cheek, followed by a faint chuckle, the sound distorted and wrong, as if it were coming from a broken speaker. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, to keep his eyes shut. This was the ultimate test, he told himself, the climax of the challenge. Then he felt something even worse, the sensation of thin, skeletal fingers sliding into his hair, tugging gently as if to coax him into opening his eyes. His stomach churned with terror. He could feel the fingers tightening, pulling, the nails scraping his scalp. He fought the urge to scream. "Just one look," a voice whispered, soft and taunting. His heart was racing. He had no idea how much time had passed, and he was starting to question if he could make it. But he held firm, clenching his fists, pressing his eyelids tightly shut. The whispering returned, closer this time, surrounding him. Some of the voices were crying, others laughing in a high-pitched, manic tone, and some were whispering things he couldn't understand. And then he heard his own voice, soft, pleading. "Please, just open your eyes. Just a peek," it said, sounding exactly like him, terrified and desperate. "No," he whispered to himself, trembling. Then the voices fell silent once more. Greg sat in the stillness, his heart racing, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Just as he started to relax, he heard footsteps. They were soft at first, but they grew louder, echoing around the room. It sounded like a group, all walking in perfect rhythm, drawing closer and closer. Then they stopped, right in front of him. He held his breath, not daring to move, but the footsteps didn't leave. Instead, he felt the floorboards creak and something cold pressed against his cheek. A fingertip tracing slowly down his face. "Why won't you look at us?" A voice hissed, barely above a whisper. Greg's resolve was crumbling. His entire body screamed for him to open his eyes, to run, to do anything to escape. But he forced himself to remain still. And then something changed. He felt warmth around him, and a soft, familiar hum filled the air. His mother's voice. The lullaby she used to sing to him as a child. He could almost picture her standing in front of him, her gentle smile reassuring him. "Open your eyes, honey," her voice said. "It's safe now." Tears filled his eyes, and he wanted so desperately to believe it, to let the comforting sound wash away the terror. But deep down, he knew it couldn't be real. "No," he whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. The lullaby stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening guttural roar that filled the room. The air grew icy cold, and something grabbed his shoulders, shaking him violently. The voices returned, screaming and shouting in a chaotic frenzy that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He felt himself being lifted from the chair, his feet leaving the floor as unseen hands gripped him, holding him in the air. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he was paralyzed with terror. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. He fell back into the chair, the impact jarring him. Silence filled the room once more, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes staring at him, waiting. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and he had no idea how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. But finally, a soft chime echoed through the room. "Time's up," a voice said, clear and calm, with a hint of amusement. Greg's eyes shot open. The room was empty, the darkness gone. He was alone, sitting in the chair, his heart pounding. He stumbled out of the house, disoriented, his mind racing with fragments of what he'd experienced. As he made his way home, he felt the weight of those voices lingering, haunting him, whispering in the corners of his mind. A week passed, and Greg tried to put the experience behind him, convincing himself it had all been a trick, a setup. But then, late one night, he received a message on his phone from an unknown number. It simply read, "We're still here." Terrified, he turned off his phone and tried to sleep. But as he lay in bed, he began to hear the whispers again, soft and faint, calling his name. And this time he was certain they wouldn't go away. The story that seemed to be spreading around town always sounded ridiculous to Alex. According to legend, there was an old website that only appeared at midnight. It was called The Witness. Once you entered, a live video feed would show up, and you'd see something you weren't supposed to. No one could agree on what it was exactly. The stories ranged from cryptic images of abandoned houses to sightings of things so horrifying that people supposedly went mad after watching. And once you viewed it, the legend went, something would start watching you back. Alex was skeptical, but that didn't stop his curiosity. He was sure it was just an urban legend, maybe some creepy gimmick. So, at midnight on Halloween night, he opened his laptop, connected to an anonymous browsing network just to add a little thrill, and typed "The Witness" into the search bar. He'd expected nothing, but to his surprise, a plain black screen appeared with a single line of text. "Are you ready to witness?" He grinned, thinking it was some kind of prank website, and clicked yes. The screen flickered, and then a live feed came up, showing an empty street lined with old houses. The feed looked slightly blurry, like an old CCTV camera. As he watched, the camera panned down the street, slowly, almost as if someone were controlling it. There was no sound, just the steady, unnerving pan of the camera moving house to house, closer and closer to somewhere. Then he saw it. A house with a flickering light in the upstairs window. The camera paused there, zooming in slowly on the window. Alex could barely make out what was inside. It looked like someone was moving, pacing back and forth. He squinted, trying to make out the figure. Then, in an instant, the person stopped moving and turned toward the camera. Alex's stomach tightened. The figure in the window was hard to make out, shadowed and indistinct, but it felt as if it were looking directly at him. The screen glitched, the figure's face blurring, then sharpening, and in that split second, Alex felt an odd jolt of recognition. The figure looked like him. Alex stared at the screen, barely breathing, as he watched the shadowy figure in the window. It wore the same clothes he was wearing now, and its posture, its movements, were all too familiar. The figure raised its hand, and so did he, an instinctive response, as if he were looking into a mirror. His heart began to race. Just as he was about to close the laptop, the screen glitched again, and the camera panned to a different angle, this time pointing directly at his own street. "No," he whispered, his hands clammy as he gripped the laptop. The camera view showed his own apartment building, and it was zooming in on his window, his room. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he watched the screen, transfixed, terrified, unable to look away. The camera view drew closer, showing the dim light of his bedroom window. Suddenly, the screen went black. Alex stared at his reflection in the dark screen, feeling the tension drain from his body, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. He was about to close his laptop when the screen flickered back to life. This time, it was a view inside his room. He gasped, scrambling back, nearly tipping the chair over. The live feed was from behind him, showing the back of his head as he sat in front of his laptop. In the corner of the screen, a figure lurked in the shadows, inching closer to him, its face obscured by darkness. Panicked, he whirled around, but there was no one there. His room was empty. Yet, when he looked back at the screen, the figure was gone, but the camera was still showing him from behind, as if someone were watching him through a hidden lens. The screen flickered again, and a message appeared, stark and chilling. "You are now a part of The Witness." A shiver ran down his spine as his laptop shut off on its own, plunging the room into darkness. He felt a cold, creeping sensation, like someone was standing just behind him, watching him in the shadows. His phone buzzed, startling him, and he saw a text from an unknown number. "You witnessed. Now we witness you." The next day, Alex tried to brush it off as a trick, a glitch, something explainable. But as the days went on, he began to notice things. Footsteps in the hallway when he was alone, objects moving from their usual places, and at night, shadows would shift in his room, lingering just out of sight, like someone watching him from the darkness. One night, he received another text, "Check the window." He forced himself to look, his hands trembling. Across the street, in an empty apartment, he saw a dark figure standing in the window, staring at him. And he knew, in that chilling, sinking moment, that it wasn't over. The witness was watching, and it would always be watching. Ethan had always been drawn to the paranormal, but he never really believed it was real. Ghosts, haunted houses, all that. Just stories people told to scare each other. That's why when he and his friends heard about the strange, abandoned house in the middle of the woods, he was the first to volunteer to check it out. The locals called it the shifting house. Every time someone went inside, they claimed it looked different. Hallways that stretched too far, rooms that appeared where there weren't any before, doors that opened to nowhere. Some said it was cursed, others said it was simply a trick of the mind. Either way, Ethan was intrigued. So on Halloween night, he and his friends hiked out into the woods with flashlights, following the vague directions they'd gotten from the townspeople. After hours of trudging through the dark, they finally saw it. The house, standing tall and ominous, hidden deep in the forest as if it didn't want to be found. The place was bigger than they'd expected, with towering windows and rotting wooden beams. Its front door was barely hanging on by a single hinge, creaking as the wind blew through. When they stepped inside, the air was heavy, thick with an overwhelming scent of mildew and decay. Their flashlights illuminated dust-covered floors and crumbling wallpaper. The entire place felt like it was holding its breath. "Creepy," his friend Jess muttered, shining her light down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. They chuckled nervously, the sound echoing strangely in the stillness. Ethan led the way, moving deeper into the house, brushing off the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. As they explored, he noticed that certain things felt off. The rooms were too large, the ceilings too high. It was like the architecture was subtly shifting around them, bending into impossible dimensions. They made their way up a narrow staircase that groaned with every step. The second floor was eerily silent, with doors on either side of the hallway, each slightly ajar as if inviting them in. Jess and another friend, Mike, wandered into a nearby room, leaving Ethan and Sarah to explore the hallway. Ethan paused, looking around. "Guys?" he called. His voice felt swallowed by the silence. No answer. A strange tension built in his chest. He turned to Sarah, who looked just as unnerved. They approached the room where Jess and Mike had entered, but when they pushed the door open, the room was empty. His heart skipped a beat. "Jess?" "Mike, Mike," he called, louder this time. His voice echoed back, cold and empty. A door creaked down the hall, and Sarah grabbed his arm, her hand ice cold. "We were just in there, weren't we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The layout of the house had changed. Doors now lined both sides of the hallway, this stretching in an endless row, none of them where they should have been. It was as if the house were rearranging itself, shifting the walls and rooms at will. Panic set in, and they began to run, pulling open doors only to find endless, empty rooms. Every hallway looked identical, with no sign of Jess or Mike. The air grew thicker, pressing against them, making it harder to breathe. They finally stopped, out of breath, and Ethan tried to gather his thoughts. "Okay, we just need to find the staircase," he said, forcing calm into his voice. But deep down, he was beginning to realize that the house wasn't letting them out. They retraced their steps, or at least tried to. But every hallway they turned down, every door they opened, only led them deeper into the house, each room blending into the next in an unending maze. Then Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. A man, tall and thin, his back turned toward them. He was dressed in dark, outdated clothes, his frame rigid and motionless. Ethan and Sarah froze, watching the figure, fear creeping up their spines. "Excuse me," Ethan called, hoping the man was just some other unlucky explorer. But the figure didn't move. It was as if he hadn't heard them at all. He took a cautious step forward. "Hey, can you help us?" The figure began to turn so slowly it was almost painful to watch. His face came into view, gaunt and pale with dark, empty eye sockets. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, decaying teeth. Sarah screamed, and the sound seemed to trigger something in the figure. He lunged forward, moving in jerking, unnatural motions, closing the distance between them faster than seemed possible. Ethan and Sarah ran, their footsteps pounding against the warped wooden floor. They turned corner after corner, desperate to escape the man. But every hallway looked the same. Behind them, they could hear his shuffling footsteps, relentless, always just a few steps away. Finally, they found themselves at the end of a long, narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in on them, pressing tighter and tighter. The man was getting closer, his raspy breaths filling the hallway. With nowhere else to go, Ethan grabbed a door handle and shoved it open, pulling Sarah inside. They found themselves in a pitch-black room, the only light coming from their flashlights, which were starting to flicker. They held their breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, but they could still feel his presence just outside the door, waiting. Then they heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You're in my house now." The words echoed through the darkness, chilling them to the core. They stumbled backward, trying to find another way out, but the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder. Ethan's flashlight flickered, then died, leaving them in total darkness. Sarah's light dimmed as well, sputtering, and in the fading glow they saw movement all around them. Shadows twisted and writhed, figures emerging from the walls, their faces distorted and hollow. Ethan fumbled in the darkness, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We have to keep moving," he whispered, his voice shaking. They stumbled through the room, feeling their way along the walls, their hands brushing against something cold and sticky. Suddenly, they felt a breeze, an open door. With renewed hope, they ran toward it, plunging into another hallway that stretched endlessly ahead. But as they ran, the walls seemed to melt, turning into a strange, shadowy mist. The hallway twisted, distorting, as if the entire house were alive, shifting around them. Ethan realized with a sickening horror that there was no way out. Then they heard Jess and Mike's voices, distant but familiar, calling their names. Hope surged in Ethan's chest. "We're here," he shouted, running toward the voices. But as they drew closer, the voices became distorted, warping into something dark, something wrong. Jess's voice became low and guttural, her words slurred, blending with Mike's in a twisted harmony. They weren't calling for help, they were laughing. The laughter echoed down the endless hallway, growing louder, closer, until it was all around them. It was a cacophony of distorted voices mocking them, filling their ears, their minds, drowning out their thoughts. And then, just like that, the laughter stopped. They were alone again, standing in the darkness, the silence thick and suffocating. They didn't remember how long they wandered or when they stopped. By morning, search teams found them wandering near the edge of the forest, dazed, incoherent, with no memory of what had happened or how they'd gotten out. But as Ethan tried to piece together the fragments of his memory, he felt a cold dread settle over him. In the silence of his room that night, he heard it, a faint, low whisper, echoing in the darkness. "You're still in my house." And every night after, the walls of his own home seemed to shift, twist, and close in, as if he'd brought the house back with him. They say you can buy almost anything on the dark web. Jake had heard it all. Mysterious boxes, encrypted codes, even rumored rituals to contact otherworldly beings. He thought most of it was hype until he stumbled upon an ad deep in a hidden forum. It read simply, "Get answers to any question. Message the Oracle. No payment needed. Just a simple trade." The Oracle. The idea was strange and intriguing, and like a lot of things on the dark web, it had a tinge of the supernatural to it. Jake didn't believe in magic, but he was intrigued by the possibilities. He had questions that he'd wanted answers to for years, questions about things he regretted, things he couldn't forgive himself for. So, he sent a message to the Oracle, expecting either nothing or some scam artist asking for money. Instead, he got a reply within minutes. The message was short and to the point. "You will get answers, but you must first witness. Do you accept?" There was something unnerving about the phrasing, but Jake was curious. He typed back, "I accept." The screen glitched, flickered, and then went black. For a few moments, he thought his computer had crashed. But suddenly, the screen lit up with a live feed of a dimly lit room. It was empty, except for a single chair in the center, facing away from the camera. He watched, his pulse quickening, wondering if he was about to be pranked. But as he stared at the empty chair, a figure emerged from the shadows. The person's face was hidden under a dark hood, their posture rigid and unnatural. They sat down slowly, facing away from the camera, and in the corner of the screen text appeared, as if someone were typing directly into the feed. "You will watch, and then you will know." Jake's heart pounded as he leaned closer. The hooded figure began to speak in a low, distorted voice. It was hard to understand. The words slurred, but something in them was mesmerizing, as if each syllable pulled him in deeper. The figure spoke of choices, secrets, things that could not be unseen. And then it said something that made his blood run cold. For every truth, there is a cost. The screen glitched, and suddenly he saw a close-up of the figure's hand. In the person's hand was a small photograph of his childhood home. Jake's stomach dropped. There was no way they could know that. But the oracle continued, listing out details from his past, recounting memories he had buried deep, mistakes, regrets, things he thought no one else knew. He tried to close the browser, but his cursor was frozen. His fingers trembled on the keyboard, but nothing responded. He was trapped, forced to watch. The screen flickered again, and suddenly he saw another figure on the feed. This one was a woman, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She looked straight into the camera, her lips moving as if trying to say something, but no sound came through. She glanced around, panicked, as if she could sense Jake watching her, her eyes pleading. Then the screen split. On the left, the hooded figure sat motionless. On the right, the woman was crying, mouthing words, silent screams filling her face. Jake tried to look away, but something held him, something compelled him to keep watching. Text appeared on the screen. "Do you want to save her? She can be your trade." Jake didn't understand. "My trade?" He typed desperately, his hands shaking. The oracle responded immediately. "Every question you ask will require an answer in return, a piece of you. Do you still want to know?" He hesitated, but then he thought about all the things he had wanted answers to, the mysteries, the regrets, the secrets he couldn't let go of. He typed, "Yes." The woman on the screen screamed silently, her face twisting in agony, and then she disappeared. In her place, another image flickered to life. It was a dark, blurry photo of him, taken from the shadows. He recognized the setting, his apartment, his living room. It was recent. Text appeared again. "There is a cost, but you will know." Jake's skin crawled as the screen changed. Now it showed scenes from his past, intimate moments, things he had almost forgotten. He saw himself as a child, alone in his room, tears streaming down his face. He saw his parents' faces, twisted with anger, things they had said to him in the heat of arguments. He saw past relationships, things he wished he'd done differently, moments he wished he could erase. The images moved faster, flashing one after another until they blurred together. He tried to look away, but the oracle wouldn't let him. It felt as if it were pulling something out of him, something essential, something he couldn't get back. Finally, the screen went black. Text appeared one last time. "Your answer has been given. The debt is now yours." Jake's computer shut off. He sat there, staring at the dark screen, a heavy emptiness settling over him. He felt different, like something vital had been taken from him, something he couldn't quite name. The next day, he tried to go back to the website, but it was gone. No traces, no record of it in his history. He tried to tell himself it had been a nightmare, some twisted hallucination, but the hollow feeling lingered. Over the next few weeks, things started happening. He would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as if someone were standing over him, watching him in the dark. He began seeing fleeting shadows at the corners of his vision, whispers that vanished as soon as he turned his head. And every time he looked in the mirror, he felt as if he were fading, his reflection growing dimmer, less real. One night, he awoke to a sound in his room. He sat up, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the corner, a hooded figure watching him. He recognized it immediately. It was the oracle, the same one he had seen on his screen. But this time he felt the weight of its gaze, the emptiness in its eyes. It leaned in, and he heard the whisper, clear and cold, "Your debt is now collected." In the morning, Jake's friends found his apartment empty. His laptop was open on his desk, the screen flickering with static. No one ever saw him again. But rumors spread, a mysterious user account on the dark web, appearing in hidden forums, claiming to be the Oracle. And now they say, if you ask a question to the Oracle, it will answer you. But only in exchange for something precious, something irreplaceable. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the web, Jake watches, now just a part of the Oracle, forever trapped collecting debts in exchange for secrets that should never have been known. Kaylee was used to the late-night quiet. As a security guard, her shifts were long and dull, often spent staring at cameras in the flickering light of the monitor room. The building she guarded was an old office tower on the edge of town, mostly abandoned and due for demolition within the year. The owners had cut back on expenses and she was usually alone. The only thing that kept her awake was a fresh pot of coffee and her phone. One night, just as she was starting to feel the weight of sleep pulling at her, a notification popped up on her monitor. Motion detected, floor 12. She frowned. Floor 12 was closed off. There hadn't been power up there in years. Curious, she clicked on the camera feed. The screen flickered to life, showing the long, empty hallway of the 12th floor. The fluorescent lights were dim, casting a sickly glow, and everything seemed still. She waited, scanning the screen, but nothing moved. She sighed, chalking it up to a glitch, and was about to turn away when she noticed something in the far corner. A shadow that seemed to sway, almost like someone standing just outside the camera's range. Her curiosity piqued. She switched to a different camera angle, hoping to catch a better view. The hallway was empty, the shadow gone. But as she scanned the screen, her eyes widened. On one of the office doors, faintly visible, she saw something written, almost like it had been scratched into the wood. "Help me." Kaylee felt a shiver run down her spine. She switched to another camera, but the hallway was empty. Still, a nagging feeling made her check the recordings from earlier that night. She fast-forwarded through hours of footage, but there was nothing unusual until around midnight. The recording showed the hallway as it normally appeared, still and empty. But at exactly 12:01 a.m., the screen glitched, and for a brief second, a figure appeared. It was a woman, standing barefoot in the middle of the hall, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair hanging over her face. She stood there, motionless, staring directly at the camera, and then just as suddenly as she had appeared, the screen glitched again, and she was gone. Kaylee's heart pounded as she watched the clip on repeat, her mind racing. No one was supposed to be in that building, and there was no way anyone could have snuck in. The front entrance was locked, and every exit had been chained shut. Trying to shake off the creeping dread, she decided to take a walk up to the 12th floor. Maybe someone had managed to sneak in, some squatter or prankster who'd found a way to avoid detection. She grabbed her flashlight and headed toward the stairwell, her footsteps echoing in the empty building. As she ascended, she couldn't shake the heavy, suffocating feeling that grew with each step. The air grew colder and the smell of mildew and dust grew thicker. When she finally reached the 12th floor, she hesitated. The hallway stretched out before her, just as empty and dim as it had looked on the monitor. She walked slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was almost painful, each step echoing like a gunshot. She shined her light down the hallway, but it seemed endless, like stretching far beyond where it should have ended. Then she saw it, the door with the scratched message, "Help me." Her pulse quickened as she approached, the words stark and jagged, almost as if they had been clawed into the wood. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the handle. To her surprise, it turned easily, the door swinging open with a slow, painful creak. The room beyond was dark, filled with empty desks and scattered papers. She stepped inside, shining her flashlight across the room. The walls were covered in old, faded newspaper clippings, all of them torn and weathered, like they'd been up there for decades. But one article caught her eye, a photograph of a woman in a white dress, the same one she had seen on the camera. Beneath it was a headline, "Local woman mysteriously disappears, last seen in office tower." Her stomach dropped as she read the date, October 12th, 1978. A sudden chill filled the room, and she felt a presence behind her. She turned, but there was nothing, just the empty desks, the eerie silence. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm herself, but her eyes were drawn to the window at the far end of the room. And in the faint reflection, she saw her, standing right behind her. Kaylee froze, the breath catching in her throat as the woman's pale face came into focus. Her eyes were dark, hollow, filled with something that looked like despair. She reached out, her fingers brushing Kaylee's shoulder ice cold, and whispered, "Please, help me." Kaylee stumbled backward, heart racing, and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She bolted down the hallway, but the air grew thick and the hallway seemed to stretch, becoming longer and longer with each step. She could hear footsteps behind her, a slow, dragging sound that matched the rhythm of her pounding heart. Finally, she reached the stairwell and practically flew down the steps, never looking back. When she reached the ground floor, she burst out of the stairwell, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't go back up to the 12th floor, not that night or any other. She told her supervisor about the strange message and the footage, but when they reviewed the recordings, the footage was gone. It was as if it had never existed. A few days later, Kaylee couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The building seemed darker, colder, and her dreams were plagued by images of the woman's pale face, her hollow eyes staring into her own. And every night, just as she was about to fall asleep, she would hear a faint whisper, pleading, "Please, help me." She eventually quit the job, but the whispers didn't stop. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of the woman's reflection in dark windows, in mirrors, or in the corners of her vision. The woman had followed her, bound to her by the unanswered plea. And each time, just as her blood would run cold and her heart would race, she would hear it again, that haunting whisper echoing in the dark, "Help me, it's your turn now." And Kaylee began to realize maybe she would never be free.